Welcome to part 2 of the Royal Grist review of The Prince and the Doctor. Part 1 can be found in the description box below. This short TRG series is a summary breakdown and in-depth critical review of the live intimate conversation that I was a part of, participating from my one-party consent state of New York. For illustration purposes, as the participants like myself were strictly prohibited to share any of the original materials presented in this intimate conversation together, I used my superior note-taking skills and my creative mind to illustrate effectively my opinions on what was discussed by the Prince and the Doctor, to do my part in fighting against misinformation, because as you know, the Prince tells everyone it is a humanitarian crisis. Any critique that I make in this video will come from direct quotes that I wrote down during my participation in this intimate, allegedly live conversation from my one-party consent state of New York. All characters and event scenarios, even though based on real events and people, are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to persons living or dead is purely coincidental and should be viewed only for its illustrative storytelling purposes. And of course, this is all stipulated at the very beginning in my video content legal disclaimers, so feel free to rewind this video if you missed it. Let's continue ripping this apart. So in part 1, I talked about Harry's savior complex and his inability to accept some responsibility for his current mental state. In observing him, not only in this interview, but throughout the last 5 years, Harry is not putting in the work to improving his overall mental state and well-being. Now, I'm not going to say that he hasn't attended therapy sessions. I'm sure that he has therapy sessions, but my suspicion is that outside of the therapy sessions, he's not actively practicing the skill sets that are being learned in therapy into practice in real life situations, such as mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, emotional regulation, as well as distress tolerance. I'm sure many of you are going to agree with me when I say that the biggest component that's missing from Harry's therapy, yes, he is committed to change. Whether or not he made the decision to leave his family, move across to the United States, to live in California isolated, he made changes. Was that sparked on him initially? I don't think so. But according to him, in this interview, he talks about making the changes by doing all this, getting his family out of the toxic environment. But what's missing is his inability to accept and have acceptance. Without having acceptance, all the changes that you're making really means nothing because you're not willing to accept the circumstances around your interpersonal relationships. You're not willing to accept the emotions that you're feeling, if they're negative. You're not willing to accept that you're getting sick because as a result of the trauma that you keep ruminating on is causing impact to your physical health, thus requiring you to take many types of drugs, medications to some of these symptoms. All the changes that you have made doesn't mean a thing. I'd be curious to know how many therapists he has gone through in California. In this intimate conversation that I was a participant of, Harry appears to push back on the actual doctor in correcting him whenever the doctor diagnosed or said things about him that Harry didn't agree with. And this is a perfect example for illustration purposes. In the conversation that I was a participant of in the one-party consent state of New York.
Agoraphobia you talked about. You talked about your post-traumatic stress. And you also dabbled
post-traumatic stress injury rather than disorder.
If you notice, the doctor did not say post-traumatic stress disorder, but Harry is triggered.
You talked about your post-traumatic stress. And you also dabbled
post-traumatic stress injury rather than disorder.
Yeah, no, but I'm not.
No. Again, it is the conversation because again, working with veterans for so many years, I see them. They tell me that they've been diagnosed with PTSD, and I said that rolls off the tongue so well.
Yeah.
For so many people.
Yeah.
But the reality is that what I've seen in you 6 months ago to now.
Yeah.
This is not a disorder.
Exactly.
This is an injury, and also It didn't feel great when I was told by a therapist, you got PTSD. And I said, I don't feel as though I've got a disorder. If you told me that I had an injury, then you're inspiring me to heal myself.
Exactly.
And there it is, folks. I said this in part 1, Harry refuses to accept any sort of criticism as well as the terminology just because he didn't like being classified with a disorder because of his own perception and stigma around mental health. Maybe he needs to get educated to remove the stigma and bias that he obviously has, because what this man is failing to understand is that PTSD is covered under insurance, at least in the United States. And if somebody is suffering from it and needs resources, they cannot go in and file a claim for PTSI because it is not approved. So if this asshole thinks that his change in language is so important, then maybe he really needs to search deeper as to why he is so adamant about not accepting that, yes, he possibly has a disorder that has been diagnosed by a medical professional. And if he can't accept a medical professional's advice, then guess what? He's not going to be able to accept anything else because the qualified people who are trying to help him are only doing their job. And shame on this doctor for not putting his foot down and correcting him because he is the doctor. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Harry probably went through a whole bunch of therapists to the one that actually was telling him what he wanted to hear. And I would think that this guy, Dr. Mate, is probably trying to keep Harry as a client. So, of course, he's going to be understanding and agree with Harry because, one, he is a high profile client, and two, the amount of money that's probably coming in now for doing this therapy session, and I'm sure he wants to keep his relationship intact. So he's not going to piss this man off, even though he did recognize the aggression and the opposition to accepting what he was saying about certain mental illness definitions. At one point, the doctor, in his assessment after reading this book, he states to Harry, like, you seem to have a lot of self-loathing. And Harry quickly quips with self-doubt. And then the doctor says, self-doubt, yeah, okay, fair enough. Again, there is Harry disagreeing with a professional who is making assessments. Instead of just listening and asking, why do you think that I was self-loathing? Because if he didn't think so, it would be interesting to hear the other perspective. But that's part of not accepting. So when you can't accept, you really can't change, no matter how much you talk about all the things that you've been doing. When you have acceptance, then you'd be able to change the various behaviors of being mindful, of being able to improve your interpersonal relationships, like with your family. Also be able to regulate your emotions. Harry is a very emotional person, and he allows his emotional mind to overtake his behavior. The doctor begins to say, very often seeing the connections, whatever I say, then you talk about very openly about your anxiety and panic disorder. So then Harry responds and says, yeah, there was a moment of my life which was horrible. Every time I walked into a room, I felt as though it was 2 degrees warmer for me. I would just start breaking into a sweat. My face would go red, and I would be walking down a line of people shaking their hands. And the moment that I found someone who was sweating more than me, I would stop and I would continue a conversation. The people behind me saying, excuse me, sir, you need to move on, and say, give me a second. I'm okay. And over the course of 2 or 3 minutes, both our temperatures would start to reduce. They'd stop sweating. I'd stop sweating. And then I'd move on. I'd feel much better. But yeah, since age 12, apart from being in a state of shock, I was in vital flight. And I think the biggest understanding is understanding that I learned or wish I knew before was nervous system regulation. Because for me, that has always been the core of my problem. And I know I talk a lot about mental health and how certain elements of my life I've had to overcome and deal with and understand. But ultimately, this is, for me, it's more about emotional regulation, emotional well-being. So I don't doubt that Harry has been attending some type of therapy, but there's a difference between attending therapy and then putting the coping skills that you're getting in therapy into real life practice, which I don't believe that he is doing. In fact, he does admit at some part of this therapy session that he should be meditating more. It's almost like he's going through the motions to convince others that he is changing, but inside he really is not changing. What is going on with him is that his lizard brain and his mammal brain are overtaking the neocortex. And the neocortex is responsible for your rationalization, your thoughts, your ability to reason and think clearly. When your mammal brain, which is responsible for your feelings, your emotions, takes over, it's sort of when you experience this type of trauma, it kicks into overdrive, in which the lizard brain or reptilian brain goes into overdrive to protect the body because it senses at, a primal state that you're in danger, especially if you're feeling certain things. So if you're feeling sad or if you're feeling scared, naturally your heart rate's going to go up. Naturally, your body goes into this fight or flight mode. So Harry talks about this fight or flight experience that he has every time he goes to meet people, he starts sweating. But he doesn't explain what exactly is causing that, because obviously when that is happening in a fight or flight, you're normally triggered by something. I'm surprised that the general practitioner doctor didn't ask about what was the reason for the onset of the anxiety. What was it about that experience that made you have a panic attack, start sweating? That would have been important to understand. Was the trigger the flashing of the paparazzi, or was the trigger being out in public and eyes on you and feeling, people scrutinizing everything that you're doing and the pressure that you were putting on yourself? But he didn't do that. So it really didn't make any sense when Harry started talking about going on this engagement. And when he saw somebody else sweating just as much as he was able to regulate his temperature and have it come down. That made absolutely no sense. So whatever the root cause of his panic disorder or of his anxiety, he's not being honest with the public. Yes, I do believe that losing his mom definitely had an effect on him, but I do not believe that it is the root cause of the anxiety. I do believe that he is very much conscious of what other people think and does not like to be judged because he is very sensitive and cannot handle critique. So I guess what I struggle with is understanding why Harry has been saying that he suffers from post-traumatic stress. What exactly did he experience that was shocking, scary, or dangerous? Yes, I understand that his mom passed away suddenly. What is it about that event that has caused his so-called PTSI? Was it his father coming in and relaying the news and that was the shock? Or was it him walking behind the coffin and all eyes were on him and his family as he mourns his mom? But whatever he is suffering from, he is allowing his mammal brain, which is those emotions that are stored there, to impact and override the neocortex, which is the actual thought and reasoning. Those that suffer from PTSD allow the lizard brain and the mammal brain to overtake the neocortex. And what that means is that your senses are heightened, you're more on guard, you then start not doing things that you normally enjoy because there's this fear of something triggering you and the fear of going back to whatever that shocking event was, to which, you fear how are you going to handle it. That's why a lot of times people who suffer from PTSD no longer do things that they used to enjoy just because they would rather avoid having the feeling of what they felt because it's so terrible than actually doing something that is pleasurable to avoid any possibility of being triggered. It is my opinion, but I don't think that Harry is really being honest about what is really going on and what he's really experiencing. PTSD for him might be something that is acceptable to say that he has because it's not something that he was born with. And it's clear that he does have his own judgments on mental health. And for him, he won't accept that even the slightest of having a disorder because he doesn't want to feel less than or defective in a sense. With PTSD, I could see him thinking that PTSD is acceptable to have because it's not my fault. It is the fault of something that happened to me that I didn't ask for. But if, let's say, he has something more serious, which I think he is bipolar or manic depressive, there is something chemically wrong in his brain where he has difficulty regulating. And when I say regulating, and he mentions it, regulating those emotions and being able to control that those emotions don't take over his rational thought. What leads me to believe that he suffers from depression or has some form of it was that the conversation comes up and Harry starts talking about people who have depression, and the doctor asks him about it, and he says that small, short bouts. Again, grateful, actually, weirdly, for the experience because then I can understand other people, friends, whoever it is that's experiencing it or going through it. Not that I'm a professional advisor to any of these people, but to be able to have that understanding of what they're going through, though, it's always unique to that individual. I actually couldn't ask for more. It was horrible at the time, but I was also pretty grateful. It was very short. And then Mate says, you can empathize. And he says, I can empathize with it. Yeah, hugely. Which, by the way, it also, there's a disadvantage to that. Once you start feeling everybody else's damage, it's a bit too much. And that was a huge part of my life where at the beginning, I had this shield up and I was numb to my own feelings, but also numb to other people's. And here's why I think he's not telling us the full picture. So, as you can see here, he has said that he has had small, short bouts, but then at the same time said that he only had one experience with it. So either you have had it a couple times in your life, or you actually had an episode to which you could honestly say that you have been diagnosed with having depression. I believe that he has been diagnosed with depression, and he didn't want to accept that. Because later on in the conversation, he starts asking about medication for depression. So the doctor talks about his depression by saying, it's all part of the experience. Depression, by the way, again, this so called genetic disease, I don't see it that way. What does it mean to depress something? To push it down. And we push down our emotions when it's not safe to feel them, which wasn't in your family. So then Harry asks the question, and how do you feel about medication when it comes to depression? Gabor says, good question. I've taken it myself and it has helped me. I haven't taken it for decades. I don't see it. I don't need it anymore because the brain can develop new circuits. And then Harry asks this question. So, you took it for a moment in your life? And he responds, I took it for a certain period of time. And he said that it helped him. Based off of what he has been saying throughout this interview or therapy session, it leads me to believe that, yes, he probably has been diagnosed with some type of depression or some other mental illness, but refuses to accept that and refuses to take proper medication in order to help him feel different. And I think that in his understanding, he probably assumes that if he starts taking any of these kind of medications, that he will be on these medications for life in order to function pseudo-normal. With the right medication and the right therapy, he should have been in a better position than where he is now because his life has gone completely upside down. And the fact that he has destroyed all of his relationships and still talking about the same trauma and continuing to keep talking about the same trauma does not show that he has made any progress, which leads me to believe that he is not putting in the work to improve his dialectical thinking skills. And what I mean by that is dialectical thinking acknowledges the opposing or contradictory tensions or emotions that we experience as humans. It asserts that life and truth are not really black and white and that situations are more complex than good or bad, right or wrong, or all or nothing. In my opinion, Prince Harry has failed to demonstrate improvement not only from this interview, but also in the book Spare, all of the interviews he did, and let's not forget the 6 hours worth of the Netflix series that we had seen him in action. Even though the words coming out of his mouth talks about empathy, compassion, and service, his actions documented are selfish and leans towards two kinds of extremes, one being of a fixated mind, the other being more towards a fatalistic mind. And this brings me to my final thoughts for this part of the short series. He is unwilling to demonstrate any type of radical openness. In other words, Harry is not open to any type of disconfirming feedback in order to learn. Now, while he has made a lot of changes in his life, it doesn't mean he was the one who took the initiative for these changes. But having radical openness is really supposed to improve his relationships as it models humility and eagerness to learn from what the world has to offer, or at least what other people have to offer. And like the biggest element of having this kind of mindset is being able to acknowledge one's fallibility, or in other words, being wrong or have made a mistake. Clearly, admitting that marrying the Instagram loving bitch wife was a mistake and would take being radically open to come to terms with that, however painful or liberating it could be for him. A big part of being radically open is the challenge of his perceptions of reality. Harry does not see things as they are, he sees things as he is, and I think that hurts him tremendously. And finally, I think the biggest thing about being radically open, it means taking responsibility for personal reactions and emotions rather than blaming others in the world. And I do believe that the fact that he is so fixed, his mind is set on what he believes and what he thinks should be the way that it is the reason why he cannot progress forward. And by having his emotions control his thoughts and his behaviors, it doesn't help him. That's all that I'm seeing from this therapy session. Now, I'm not a doctor or therapist. This is just my opinion on what I interpreted this intimate therapy conversation session that I was a part of, and just giving you my thoughts. But what do you guys think? Obviously, leave your thoughts and comments below. And don't you worry, I will be back soon with more content. But until then, please be safe, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.
It was such a fraud.